Recording.
Thank you.
Lovely, thanks ever so much, Natalie, and thank you for inviting us to present this webinar today. Sabine, if you go to the first slide, I think it's got our details on
Lovely.
it. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Larissa Hunt. I'm a Detective Chief Inspector from Avon and Somerset Police, and I'm our force lead for honour-based abuse and forced marriage. So what that means is that my day job is largely working in child protection and looking after children that are sexually and criminally exploited. But I have a subject matter lead or a strategic responsibility for honour-based abuse and forced marriage. And I'll hand over to Sabina.
Hi everyone, great to be here, and I think we've got quite a lot of numbers coming in. So I'm the director of the Sky Project. We've been going since around 2009, so coming up to sort of 12 years now, and we provide training on forced marriage and honour-based abuse. My day job is a solicitor, but I do this on the side on a voluntary basis primarily, and we provide the training around the Southwest and to various organisations. So hopefully you'll find this training really helpful.
Great, thank you. If we go to the first slide, what we'll do first is just talk through the definition of honour-based abuse so that you get a sense of what it is we're going to be talking about for the next hour. And I'm going to read this through because I think there's a couple of elements that I'll just want to pick out and talk to you about. So honour-based abuse is an incident or crime which can involve violence, threats of violence, intimidation, coercion or abuse. Now, abuse can include psychological, physical, sexual, financial or emotional abuse. And this has or may have been committed to protect or defend the honour of an individual, family and or community for alleged or perceived breaches of the family and or the community's code of behaviour. Now, there are a number of definitions. They're all relatively similar. This is the National Police Chiefs Council's definition. And I think it's important to just highlight a couple of points here. That firstly, it can be an incident or a crime. So it doesn't have to be a crime. You don't have to have had a crime committed for there to be an incident of honour-based abuse. And when we talk about honour-based abuse, we think about that in the way that we think about domestic abuse, in that it doesn't have to be an act of violence. So it does include psychological, financial or emotional abuse as well. And then if you look at the words that are used after that, it is which has or may have been committed to protect the honour or defend the honour of an individual for alleged or perceived breaches. So you can see with has or may, alleged or perceived, that actually they're quite loose terms. You don't have to be absolutely sure or have 100% evidence to say that we think that this is honour-based abuse. So when you're working with families, service users, whatever your role is, when you think about what honour-based abuse might be, actually it can incorporate quite a lot of different scenarios which perhaps you might not have considered before. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So when we talk about honour-based abuse, and I've talked about crime or incident, I'm now going to talk a little bit about crimes, and actually there is no crime of honour-based abuse, so there is not a specific offence that is honour-based abuse, but rather lots of other offences that we are aware of that have a or can have a honour-based abuse element to them. And that can range from something relatively low level like common assault or what we call malicious communications, right the way through to harassment, coercive and controlling behaviour, stalking, through to rape and serious sexual offences, threats to kill and murder. And of course, if we were to see a murder that was related to honour-based abuse, we would call that an honour killing. And you might have heard that term before. Now, there are a couple of offences that are rather more linked to honour-based abuse than the ones that I've spoken about, and that's forced marriage. And we quite often see that within honour-based abuse scenarios and not really outside of that. And the same with female genital mutilation, because both of these offence types are inherently linked to this element of honour, shame, and having to do something within your family or your community because that's just how things are done. So those are the sorts of offences that you might come across, which actually, when you think about it, are offences that you might see within domestic abuse or within child abuse scenarios. If we go to the next slide. So when we talk about codes of honour, this can look quite different in different families and in different communities. But what we do know about codes of honour is that victims are conditioned from a really young age, from birth. You know, they grow up with this is how life is, so they know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable behaviour, either within their family or within their community. And that's normal. That is the norm for them. And they may not know that some of that is not, I mean, when we say it's not right, but some of it can border on honour-based abuse and offending and things that put people at risk of harm. And that might not be obvious to somebody who's grown up with that from such a young age. So within close-knit families and communities, being seen as honourable and having high social standing is really important. And there are some things that are a real concern for people who live within honour-based abuse communities. So things like being too Western, having short hair, wearing too much makeup, and wearing clothes that might expose your skin, the use of drugs and alcohol, having a same-sex relationship or defying parental authority. All of these things could be seen as shameful and dishonourable, and that can lead to threats, violence and abuse. And if we go to the next slide. And these are things that survivors of honour-based abuse have said. So when they have been asked what is honour, the replies have been, consists of a learnt complex set of rules that a woman has to follow in order to protect her family's name and maintain family position. It's like the weather, you can't question it. Honour is there, it's always been there. Honour is the biggest issue in my life. With every bad word, a reputation can die. So when you think about some of the things that survivors have said here when they talk about honour and what it's meant for them, you can see how big that this is for somebody who's been the victim of honour-based abuse. You know, the biggest issue in your life, or with every bad word, a reputation can die. And then to think what that might mean or what the implications could be for that person. We're talking that this has a really significant impact on people's lives. And I'm going to hand over to Sabina, who's going to talk about more specifically forced marriage.
Right, so I'm going to start with a definition as well, and there's lots of crossovers with the definition of honour-based abuse. And it is a marriage in which one or both spouses do not consent to the marriage and duress is involved. Duress can include physical, psychological, financial, and emotional pressure. And in cases of vulnerable adults who lack capacity to consent, duress is not required. So that definition over the years has expanded. So it's a government definition, and it's expanded because there's been a lot of cases through disabilities, forced marriage amongst disabilities communities, and what they've realised is the level of duress that can happen as well, that it's just not a physical issue, it could be psychological, and that psychological pressure can start from quite a young age, that the pressure sort of escalates until they get forced into a marriage. So some misconceptions around forced marriage, and usually this one slides in as I get people's opinions as to what the misconceptions are. Given the numbers, I'm just going to go through them, and maybe people want to ask questions at the end. But there are a number of misconceptions about forced marriage, and it's not helped by media representation, what's out there in the public domain. So here today, we are going to tackle some of those misconceptions head on. So those misconceptions are the arranged marriages being the same, religion, that it's part of my religion, cultural, that it affects only women, really important one, and that it affects only Asian communities. So I'm going to go through each of those points in turn. So arranged marriages, what are they? Well, the main thing here, the main word that you need to take away is about consent, that both couples are happy with going ahead with it, that they choose to, that they are both saying yes. So in the arranged marriages, the families of both spouses take a leading role in arranging the marriage, but the choice of whether or not to accept the arrangement remains with the prospective spouses. So arranged marriages have developed over the years as well. So we get many couples who are introduced via families, especially some through in my own family, and then they actually date for a while, and then they decide to get married. But it's the choice, it's that consent. The choice is down to them to say, yes, they are happy to do that. So forced marriage and religion, and what I tend to get through the number of training sessions that I delivered is that many people feel quite nervous about tackling the issue that it's part of my religion, because they don't know that religion. They don't understand that religion, and I can I understand that at the beginning when somebody comes to you and says it's part of my religion. Oh, I can't address that because I don't understand it. But from here, from this training, you can take away that forced marriages cannot be justified on religious grounds. Every major faith condemns it, and freely given consent is a prerequisite. Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh marriages. So if there is somebody who comes up to you and says that it's part of my religion, you can say that it isn't. And you can then protect that individual, because that's the main thing here. That's what you want to do. If you're dealing with these victims who come and are concerned and need to have help of some sort, maybe they need some clarification as well. They might be going to see religious leaders who may be saying that it's part of their religion, but this training hopefully can give you the confidence to say that it isn't. So forced marriage and culture, it's not just an Asian issue, and it's very hard when quite a lot of the members of the Sky Project are delivering, and we're all from Asian communities, but it's not just an Asian issue. And again, not helped by media, but particularly in Bristol, we've got a huge issue amongst Gypsy and Roma communities. We've also got Orthodox Jewish communities that are suffering from forced marriage. And actually in the Gypsy Roma community, the forced marriage can be quite physically abusive and quite severe. So it's really important to consider other communities, because if you don't, it really does deny a voice to those who've experienced it, and it stops them potentially from coming forward because they think, oh well, that's not what happens to me, it just happens to the Asians. So it's important that you don't, and we stick in Prince Charles and Diana, and this was put in before the Crown. Okay, so when I watched that, it was really clear to me that we've got the obvious psychological pressure, the pressures from both families about being together, and that duress, the financial gain, it's a certain status amongst the couples. So it's really important that you consider all communities so that they have a voice and they can come forward. So who does it affect? Well, it affects both men and women. So it's important to recognise that it's not just a female issue. And the problem we have with men is that they don't come forward as much. And certainly when we started as the Sky Project, I think the percentage that were going to the forced marriage unit to seek help was around 15%. And now this has increased to around 21%. So it has been a steady increase, and more men are coming forward, but it's important to recognise that, you know, they have a voice as well. There might be concerns there, particularly in the LGBTQ community, where they feel that, you know, there's pressures because they may be gay, and coming forward is always a very, very difficult thing to do. So we've got ages, people of all ages are forced to marry, but statistics show highest rates among women and girls between 13 and 30. And actually, the even higher statistics are those between 16 and 25, because what we do tend to get is girls that have finished their GCSEs, and that's the cutoff point to say their family feel, right, it's time for you to get married and settle down and not continue your education. And it could really come out of the blue. Sometimes they know it's happening and it's going to happen, but sometimes it really is out of the blue. So again, touching on the fact that it's not just a South Asian community issue, various communities, and I've mentioned the Gypsy and Roma and Orthodox Jewish community. So moving to the next slide. Right, statistics. So these have been updated recently. So we've got 1,200 cases dealt with every year. And we have, in 2020, that figure went down. Now, does that mean that there's not as many forced marriage cases? No, it does not. The issue is COVID. We've had a lot of families that haven't been able to take their child away to get them forced into a marriage. But what we have seen is charities reporting a near to 200% increase, which is absolutely huge during the COVID period. And what concern we do have is that once COVID is lifted, there's going to be a surge of cases where they're going to be forced into marriage because that's what they waited for. Now, and at the moment, we've got still some travel may be restricted and people aren't traveling to certain countries, but as soon as things are lifted, even if they're lifted gradually, it's really important to, you know, remember that there could be cases because that's the time that they're waiting to be able to take them abroad and potentially force them into a marriage. So we've got in 2020 26% cases concerning children under 18, 15% under 15, which is quite a high percentage really, 21% concerning men, and then we've got the 10% involved victims with mental capacity. Again, that's going to be on the increase really. I think the concern here is that it really hasn't been recognised, you know, those with disabilities and mental capacity issues. People haven't been acknowledging that there might be, if they are getting married, that there might be a forced marriage element to it. And similarly in child protection cases, if you dig deep and find out a story, you might find out that there's been sort of a background of forced marriage or marriage that they didn't really want to. So statistics are very difficult, but what we can get from the forced marriage unit is these are the people who pick up the phone and they help them and refer them as they need to. And there's a huge underreporting. I mean, I think that's just common knowledge because we, you know, the victims aren't coming forward enough. And that's a concern in the Southwest as well as across the UK. So the big why do they actually take place? Well, there's a few reasons, and I'm going to go through again all of them and perhaps speak to you all about that at the end if you have questions. But there's a patriarchal issue. So it's mainly women, but not always. Now, times are changing. So what we are realizing is that women are also taking a major role in these cases, in these forced marriage cases. It's not just the men. Men might be involved, but women are perhaps leading them into a position as well, and maybe jointly doing it with them. So it's not just a male issue here. So maintaining honour, or is it, which is what Larissa touched on, that is it's a very complex word, honour and is it. What is honourable in my family might be very different to what is honourable in another family, and that's the difficulty. So we have different, what is honourable to me, for example, the Western side of things, and what you dress and what you wear. So what Larissa mentioned earlier, but Naz Shah described it as she had a really nice definition of it, and I think that's what people can take away. And she mentioned the word is embryonic. So it starts like you're in the womb. That honour is already there. So she says that it defines my existence, a cloak that clothes you, covers you. It's an absolute conduct. It's embryonic. We inherit it with conception. Is everything. It's something you crave for, in that you want respect. On the other end, it leads to murder. So it really is from birth that they have to maintain this sort of honour and is it. Then we've got customs and traditions. So what we have is many people who might come to this country, they are holding on to some kind of custom and tradition. We don't really know what that is, but potentially there is a cultural identity crisis. So they may feel like holding on to some kind of custom or tradition is by forcing their children into a marriage, because from the outside, the community think that, you know, they are honourable. They are, you know, they're marrying somebody in their community. That's an honourable thing. They're maintaining those customs, they're maintaining those traditions, and we haven't forgotten about our country of origin. So it could be in relation to that. And we've got controlling sexuality. So again, I touched on the LGBT community. So I went to a training up north in Birmingham, and what came about was that there was two couples living together, and the actual couples, it was a boy and a girl and a boy and a girl, but their actual couples were girl, girl and boy, boy. But the only way that they could stay in the community was by, from the outside looking in, was by saying that they were married in a heterosexual relationship. And actually, it's living a lie in some ways, but what they're holding on to is that they don't lose their community. They are still there in the community, and they're still there with the family, because what we have is that if you have to flee and leave everything behind you, you are leaving everything. So that is your family, your community, everything, and that is a really difficult thing to do, which is why we get a lot of cases where they go back to the home and go back to the family, because that's just the emotional turmoil that happens. So we got financial gains. So sometimes that financial gain is from a very young age. So when they are very young, two families get together and say, you know, our boy and our girl are going to get married, and this is the decision we'll make, and we can pool in our finances. Even in, you know, in sort of high-end families. So again, it's sort of the money's coming together, and like I mentioned in the Crown, and even in sort of middle class, upper class families, we've got two well-off families coming together and choosing their partners for their children. And then we've got strengthening partnerships. So again, that's a sort of financial gain, and it's strengthening those partnerships, strengthening that family. The community look at them and think, wow, you know, that's an honourable thing. They are, you know, they look good as part of the community. And then we've got UK residence and citizenship. So of course, if they want to get the UK residence citizenship, they may get married abroad and get them brought over from a different country, and certainly the sponsorship age changed from a younger age to 18 to 21, I think, as a result of forced marriage concerns. So providing someone with a carer. So I mentioned the fact that we have got an increase in those who lack mental capacity, who've been forced into a marriage. And that's one of the main things. So the parents believe that they can provide somebody, what they have concerns that what happens if when I die, who's going to look after my child? And the way that they feel that is the best approach is that they need somebody to do it by forcing them into a marriage. They will have that constant partner right until the end. They think they're doing good, but actually, you know, that person needs to understand that they're going into sexual relationships as a relationship as well. And a lot of the time they don't. Now, these marriages, sometimes religious marriages, can happen very quickly over the phone. It just requires a religious leader to be in the middle and just say, do you agree? Yes. Do you agree? And that's it. The marriage is done. So you don't even have time to assess whether that person has capacity. They don't even mind if they have capacity or not. And that's a real concern. So the marriages can happen really quickly. So the outcome. So this is why us as the Sky Project, and also Larissa is, you know, trying to advocate about forced marriage and honour-based abuse, because we don't really want these outcomes to happen. This is a problem. We get domestic violence and abuse. We get suicide and self-harm, depression, sexual abuse, child abuse, female genital mutilation and human trafficking. And the tip of the iceberg is that there's 14 honour killings a year. That's more than one a month. And the reason why they say that it's the tip of the iceberg is because who actually reports them missing? It's family who report people missing. And if the family are the ones who have committed the crime, they're not going to report them. And actually, when I go through case studies later, you'll see that it's third parties who get involved in these cases. And that's why it's so important that we all have a role to play, that we all sort of get involved and we all understand the concept so that we can help. So I'll pass you on to Larissa now for the legislation, a really important part.
Remember to unmute myself. Thank you. Yeah, so it's really important that you know that forced marriage is a criminal offence. This was introduced in 2014 as part of the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act. And the legislation says that a person commits an offence if he or she uses violence, threats or any form of coercion causing another person to enter into the marriage, and marries somebody who lacks the mental capacity to consent to the marriage, whether they're pressured to or not. And the maximum penalty in a criminal court is 7 years imprisonment. So it's really important that you understand that a forced marriage is absolutely domestic abuse. It's a breach of a person's human rights. And you must be able to give free and full consent, as Sabina has already said. And from us, from a policing perspective, we look at consent similarly to how you would think about consent to sex, making the difference between sex and a rape. You have to be able to give free and full consent. And this applies to children, young people and adults. It's not specific to you needing to be an adult to be forced into marriage. And it's also important that you know that a marriage is also any religious or civil ceremony of marriage. So Sabina's already mentioned about how a marriage can take place over the phone. And we've certainly seen reports within Avon and Somerset of real concerns about a marriage potentially taking place over the phone, especially during the pandemic, where it's been a lot harder for people to get together. So it applies if the victim and the person arranging or forcing the marriage is in England or Wales. It can also apply if the victim is in England or Wales and habitually resident in England or Wales, but might not be in England or Wales at the time that the offence takes place. And it could be that neither the victim or the person forcing the marriage are in the UK, but as long as one of them is a UK national, then again, the offence takes place. And the government have introduced lifelong anonymity for victims of forced marriage as well, to encourage more victims to come forward, because we know that this is a hidden crime. We know that this is really difficult for people to talk about. It's really difficult to report. Like Sabina said, the emotional turmoil for somebody, being within a loving family, having a really good relationship with all of their family members, but being forced by their family to do something that they really don't want to do. How do you deal with that? Because when you say no, or if you say no, then you might be completely ostracized from your family. And that's really, really difficult to comprehend and to do, which again, as Sabina said, is another reason why we don't have the reports come through, but also why people might make a report or might suggest that something's possibly not quite right or something might be wrong, but then they return to their family because that break is just too difficult for them to do. What I would say, just to point out as well, that if your person who's being forced into marriage is under 18, then that's obviously a child protection matter as well. If we go to the next slide. So forced marriage protection orders were introduced in 2007, and these are preventative orders. So it's really important to understand that this isn't any good if a forced marriage has already taken place. This is what we want to do to prevent a marriage from happening. So if there are concerns that somebody might be forced into marriage, this is something that can be applied for to help protect that victim. So it's there to protect the person who's been or forced into marriage against their wishes. It exists alongside the criminal offence. And it's important to know that anybody can apply for a forced marriage protection order. So this could be applied for through, the application is made through the family courts, and it can be made by the victim themselves. It could be made by a third party. So we know within Avon and Somerset, we have Next Link, for example, who are our support services for victims of domestic abuse, and they can make orders. As can any solicitor or anybody else, but also the police and local authorities can also apply for the orders. And certainly when these first came into being, the police applied for a lot of them. So we've got the experience in doing it. However, what we would say is that we would want the local authority or another agency to lead on it, because it exists alongside the criminal offences, but it's not criminal, it's civil. So the good thing about the orders is that it means they are notified. So it doesn't matter who takes out, they'll be notified to the police regardless of who obtains that order. It means that we are able to put certain markers on our national systems so that if somebody's taken outside of the country, we're aware of it and we know that this order exists. So again, we can take preventative action. It may be that there's a clause on there to say that somebody has to surrender their passport, because the police can't just seize passports. You can seize a passport if it's evidence of an offence, but a forced marriage and going abroad, you can't just seize a passport. So they can be really useful orders, sort of clauses to be put in the order. And it's really clear then to family members and authorities and partner agencies that this is the risk, these are the concerns, and these are the conditions that people have to abide by in order to protect the victim. So they're really useful orders. Going back to the offence of forced marriage, we know that there have been a couple of prosecutions within the country. We definitely, Sabina and I were talking earlier, we know that there's definitely been 3. We think there's possibly been a 4th. So that's not many, considering when the legislation came in. And again, there's lots of reasons for that, mainly because we're not always aware that forced marriages have taken place because they're not reported, but also because victims may not want to work with the police in terms of a prosecution. And then thinking about what an evidence-led prosecution could be can be quite challenging in these circumstances. But I'm going to hand over to Sabina now, who's going to talk through a case study.
Unmute, yeah. Standard thing on Zoom. So Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about a couple of cases. Some of you might be familiar with these cases or have an idea. I think it's really important to share with you their stories, because this is probably the most extreme side of things, where it leads to an honor killing. And like we've said, both of us have said, we're trying to be preventative and stop it getting to this stage. And there could have been, from a variety of services, there could have, there were failures, and we've got to learn from those and move forward and try and stop it from happening again. So the first case I'll deal with is Banaz Mahmood. So Banaz Mahmood, it was a 2006 case. So it was quite a while ago. So a lot of things have changed and improved since then. And unfortunately, this is a situation where Banaz went to the police 5 times, and it wasn't picked up and it wasn't dealt with properly. So Banaz unfortunately was pretty much forced into a marriage when she was younger. She had an incredibly abusive relationship and she wanted to leave him. So she decided to make that move, and obviously going to her parents, she spoke to them and they just wanted her to go back to the relationship and make it work, because it was dishonorable for her to leave that relationship. But she wanted to leave him. It was abusive and she suffered from rape constantly, and she went to the police because she had concerns about family members following her as a result of leaving her husband, and she had real concerns that they were stalking her, and that she had concerns about her safety. And the turning point in Banaz's case is when she was in another relationship and she was spotted kissing her boyfriend Rama at the station. And this was a turning point for the community and her parents and family. And what was arranged was that something would be done about it. So the family got together and they decided that they would kill Banaz. Now, the first time when her father tried to kill her, he brought her back to the house and said, we want to have a chat. And he asked her to drink whiskey and said, don't turn around. And she turned around and there were, he had rubber gloves on and was going at her towards her neck to kill her. She managed to get out of the window at the back and she broke a neighbour's window, and she was taken by ambulance. She had no shoes on, and at the hospital, Rama managed to take a video recording of what happened, and she said that it was her father tried to kill her. I'm not sure whether it was at the hospital itself, but the policewoman who was there didn't believe her and said that she was just a drunken teenager, and also was trying to prosecute her for the damage to the window. So Banaz has actually, she went to the police 5 times, this story, and she didn't manage to get the help that she needed. And eventually this led to her death, things not being picked up. She even wrote a letter to the police to say, if I'm going to be killed, these are the people that are going to kill me. Until Caroline Good sort of got on the case to find, this was a DCI who actually took on the case and ended up prosecuting all the people involved in her death. Unfortunately, Banaz was brought back to the house and she was killed by cousins, but not just killed, she was raped. And we talk about honour, raped and strangled, and we talk about honour in the sense that these cousins in prisons were bragging about it. So there were recordings about the killings, and they were bragging about killing her in the way that they did, because they thought she was so dishonorable. Now, I delivered a training recently to police through Larissa. One of the chaps there said, you know, he was just so shocked about the fact that it was literally a kiss with her boyfriend at the station that was a turning point to want to kill your own child. And it was a shock about what is honourable and what, you know, that to us is nothing. We don't think it's, you know, it's nothing, is it? But what I was saying, what I asked them to take away is that if that person thinks they are at risk because of some minor incident like that, you need to believe them, because they know the effects of, they know their family, they know what their thought process is more than you would. So even if you think it's nothing, it's important that you take it seriously. So unfortunately, Banaz was killed, but she, the Caroline Good, who took on the case, managed to prosecute everyone. She's got a really good book that goes through the case and all the difficulties she had. And what she did have was considerable difficulty with the community. So when she was asking the community whether they had seen Banaz, they would say, yeah, we saw her last week. We saw her the other day, but she had already been killed by then. So there was lots of, you know, the community was very closed. They did not want to help. They did not want to help the police, to the extent that, you know, there were no photos of Banaz in the house. That's what Caroline found very difficult. You know, they didn't really hold her memory, and to this day she gets visited to her grave by third parties. And her sisters are speaking out more. So it really does involve third parties that can make a difference in these cases. So the second one that I'm going to talk about is Shafelia. So Shafelia was a 17-year-old girl from Warrington, and that was quite an old case as well. As 2003. There was a history with social services with Shafelia. She was constantly running away from home. They were aware about her. She'd also written quite a few poems at school where she had written about the conflict and the difficulties between her life at home and her life in the Western world. Shafelia got taken abroad and they were trying to force her into a marriage abroad. Out of desperation, she drank bleach. And because she was deemed as sort of damaged goods, she came back home. But what she had done then is dishonored the family, and they weren't happy about that. So what we get is a situation, the family's not happy with what she'd done, and it was the parents. We've got not just the father, we've got the mother and father both involved with her death. To the extent that they suffocated her in front of the other children, to make a point to say, look, if you do anything like that, this is what's going to happen to you. So you can imagine like the trauma that the children are suffering from probably to this day. We've got a court case that didn't happen until 9 years later. The reason being is that they didn't have enough evidence. So they had suspicions that the parents were involved, but they didn't have enough evidence. And the turning point was when one of the sisters organised a robbery at the house, but it was quite a brutal robbery. So there were firearms and all sorts involved. When they arrested her and they said, what are you playing at? What's going on? And she said, she blurted out that she saw them kill her sister. And it was her evidence that was quite crucial for the case, and also evidence from children at school. They actually gave their witness statements and evidence at the hearing to say, what they saw Shafelia write, what they heard as friends, and it was the teachers that said that she was missing. There's something going on. This is why even in a work environment, a school environment, a professional environment, please ask questions, find out. and see where this person is. Don't just ignore it, and that's important. So 9 years later, both the parents were prosecuted, but you can see the crumbling of the financial, like the family dynamics, and the effects that this would have on family. And even in Banaz's case, when she was with her new boyfriend, Ramat gave evidence at the trial. 10 years later, he committed suicide, because it's just the trauma and the emotional trauma that they go through, and having a separate life, losing the love of his life. So I'm sorry that I've had to go through these cases, but I think it's really important so that you realise the extent of your little help at the beginning, or you just listening to somebody at the beginning, could potentially stop them from getting to this stage. I think that's yours, Larissa.
Yeah, thanks, Sabina. What Sabina's just talked about are 2 cases where there were actually some very clear signs that honour-based abuse or forced marriage were concerns within those families and for those victims. I mean, Banaz couldn't have been clearer that she thought she was going to be killed, and she told the police who was going to kill her, yet nothing was done. She reported a rape, yet nothing was done. Some of those signs, you know, I would like to think that we're all well educated and trained enough now that we would pick those up and we would deal with them. But that's why training and education in this area is absolutely so important and fundamental, because actually some of the signs may be not that obvious. They might be difficult to spot, and taken on their own, they might mean nothing at all, but thinking about it and thinking about the bigger picture, you might then be concerned. And we would ask you to exercise your professional curiosity and to ask questions and to explore whether there are those honour-based abuse or forced marriage concerns for that person or within that family. So here we've got a slide that talks about some of the signs that you might see within your particular area of business as a professional. And I won't go through them all, because if you want the slides, Natalie's already explained how you can get them. But just I'll touch on a few, and I'll start at the top with education. Absence and persistent absence, I think, are a really key indicator for us. If you think about a child being missing, where are they? Why aren't they at school? They should be there. And we do find that sometimes children may have been taken outside of the country as well. So they may not be at school because they have been taken to another country for marriage. And we had that just last year in the run up to the pandemic. And that's really important that that's reported, and we follow that through, because the police can work with other international law enforcement agencies to get people back from other countries. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So there's a lot there about absence, fear of forthcoming school holidays, surveillance by siblings or cousins, changes in behaviour. Like I said, some of these on their own you might not think much about, but just have that professional curiosity to think about what do these things mean for this individual. In terms of employment, I think there's some really important things here that might sort of give a sign of honour-based abuse, particularly around financial control and confiscation of wages and income. You know, that's an indication potentially of domestic abuse. If it's domestic abuse, is it honour-based abuse? You know, certainly if you're having to be accompanied to and from the workplace and you can't travel on your own, that could be another sign. And just remember that within your own organisations, your colleagues could be victims or perpetrators of honour-based abuse. You know, this isn't just something that happens in a completely isolated way. This could be happening for your colleagues, and so just think about that. I think the family history is important, because you might see that siblings have been forced to marry, so there might be a history of forced marriage within that family. Certainly self-harm or suicide of siblings, and certainly I think where we see financial concerns within families, we've already talked about how a marriage can help a family with their finances, and that's one of the things that I think we're really concerned about actually when lockdown eases and travel is allowed to happen, that we, you know, are concerned that this has been a really hard time financially for a lot of people. is there going to be an increase in forced marriage as soon as the travel really opens up? Because there might well be a financial incentive behind that. What I want to touch about just for health and the police in particular is we do mention female genital mutilation here, and I just want to talk about that a little bit in relation to the sort of context of Bristol and how we work around female genital mutilation in Bristol. We definitely know that there are a lot of women who have had female genital mutilation or who have been cut, and largely that happened before they came into the UK. We don't really know what the picture is of children being cut in the UK or being taken out of the UK to be cut. We don't actually think it's as high as we first thought, and we have a different way of working around female genital mutilation in Bristol, with a really good process in place with education, who complete risk assessments around concerns, and then it only gets referred through to social care and the police if we have got some really significant risk indicators, just because we know that our previous working practices really had a significant impact on some of our communities in a really adverse way. So whilst it can be an indicator, I just want to sort of give it that caveat, if that's okay. And female genital mutilation really is probably another webinar in its own right. But certainly from a police perspective, thinking about reports of domestic abuse, we actively encourage officers to think about honour-based abuse and to think about asking questions at the scene, such as how important is honour or shame to your family? If there's talk of an arranged marriage, okay, what would happen if you said no to that arranged marriage? Because if that person says no, then it's not an arranged marriage. You know, a lot of people think that they're going into an arranged marriage, but they don't want to do it and don't understand that at that point it's a forced marriage. And so sometimes it's our awareness that's really important, because we need to have that conversation with the victim. So thinking about threats to kill in particular, we do see a lot of threats to kill within honour-based abuse reporting. And for health, there are some things for health agencies to consider around eating disorders and self-harm or attempted suicide, and Sabina's already mentioned how that's been seen in case studies. So really important things for you to think about when you're working with victims, families and people in your jobs. And again, don't forget that your colleagues could also be a victim or a perpetrator as well. And just again, I've said it a couple of times, professional curiosity, that's what we absolutely want you to use, and to ask questions. And if we go to the next slide, the one chance rule. So we talk about this a lot, to say you may only have one chance to speak to a victim. So if you're in school and somebody has made mention of something, you might only have one chance to get that right with that victim at that time, to do the right thing for them. The same if a person comes into the police station and says, I need to talk to somebody about something that's happening within my family. You may just get that one chance to get as much information as you can and to do as much safeguarding as you can in that moment. So what should you do? What I would first say is that the first thing you should do is listen and really hear what that person is saying to you. And like Sabina's already said, it might not think to you that that's a really significant issue, but have an understanding of what that means within that family, within that community, and think about the risk. If the victim tells you there's risk, the likelihood is there is risk, and you should deal with that risk as they perceive the risk, not as you perceive the risk. So you should create an open and supportive environment. What you really want to do is take that person so that you can speak to them in private on their own. And they may have come with friends, and they might say that they're with safe family members or safe friends, but at that moment you don't know. And you really want to be able to speak to them on their own, and you can ask them to wait somewhere else. So although the victim might say that they're safe, you don't know that yet, and you do really need to think about them being by themselves. If they can't speak English or speak English very well, you don't want to muddle through. You absolutely need to understand what it is the victim is saying. So if the victim says, I can speak a little bit of English and I'll be fine, that's not necessarily the case. You do really need to understand what can be a really complex matter. And if somebody only speaks a little bit of English, you're not going to get that detail or that understanding or assessment of risk right. So it's really important that you use an interpreter, and you want to consider using an out of area interpreter. In some cases, if you have the option, you might also want to think about the gender of the interpreter as well, but we know that that's not always an option. So if you've got an interpreter on the phone, so for example in the police we use language line, that is absolutely better than nothing. You do want to try and use an interpreter where you can. You need to have enough understanding of honour-based abuse and forced marriage to be able to have a conversation with the victim about what's happening for them. And you do need to reassure them that everything will remain confidential unless there's a really significant safeguarding issue. For example, if they report concerns about a sibling, for example, and that sibling's a child, we have a duty to follow our child's statutory safeguarding procedures. What I do want to just say first and foremost is that safeguarding is the absolute key. You want to safeguard before you do anything else. So it's thinking about, how am I going to make this person safe? What's the risk? How do I do it? And it might mean that actually that person needs to immediately go into accommodation somewhere else. We might be looking at a refuge, a hotel overnight. We might absolutely have to say, you cannot go home, the risk is too great. Or it might be that that person is absolutely adamant that they're going to go home, they're going to go back to their family that night. We can't stop them from doing that. So how are we going to mitigate the risks at that point? So there are some things that we can do to mitigate risk around honour-based abuse and forced marriage. And we think about safety planning, and there are lots of specialists that can help you do this. So we'll talk about some of the specialists a little bit later towards the end of the presentation. But certainly within the police, social care and health, and there are a number of charities that are able to advise. We have subject matter experts who can help you. And most organisations will have procedural guidance that you can access. But certainly there are some things that the police can do very specifically that other agencies can't. One of those is that we can take fingerprints and DNA from victims. And the obvious reason that we might want to do that is if that we think they might go missing or they might be killed, and it's really important for us to get that at that time. Within our biometric kits that we've got in the police, we've also got a handout which has got a list of services for the victim that they can take away with them, so that if you've only got that one moment and that opportunity, you can give that at that time as well. If the victim wants to do that, they have to consent, and when we've got the packs to do that. And we would ideally want to obtain copies of any travel documents, passports, etc., a photograph, and then what we can do is place an HBA marker on our national systems. And what that means is if they are to go through one of our airports, it would mean that the staff at that airport would be able to stop them and speak to them on their own and ask questions and check that they are happy with that travel, that it's safe, that it's okay. It doesn't work in terms of the ferries or the Channel Tunnel, is the caveat with that. But there are certain things that the police can do that other agencies can't, which I just think is important to mention. When we talk about moving the victim, I think it's really important that we just say we do move the victim, not the suspects, because the suspects will always know where the victim is, therefore they'll never be truly safe. So that's the sort of good practice that I would say you think about when you're moving a person. We obviously don't like to, you're treating the victim in a way that you don't really want to treat them because they're the victims, so they should stay at home, but it's too risky in these cases, I would suggest. If you're thinking about how you might manage somebody who's absolutely determined to go home and carry on living within that family environment, you might think about, okay, how can we contact you safely? What are the safe things in your life? Do you work? Can you access the doctors? Are you in education or college? what are the good times for us to contact you and check that you're okay? Shall we have a safe word so that when I call you, you know it's me and this is a word that we've agreed between us? Or shall we have a word that you use if I call that it's not safe for you to speak to me, and we can end the call and we can try again another time? So thinking about those sorts of things. We can also place markers on families' addresses as well that just alert agencies to the fact that this is a concern. So those are some of the things that we can do. And I've also mentioned that the police can work with international law enforcement as well. So if we've had a concern that somebody's been taken to another country for forced marriage, we can think about how we might get that person back from that country and repatriate them. If we go to the next slide, because we've talked about what we do, there are some really important things that we absolutely shouldn't do. So in relation to a report from a victim that they are concerned about honour-based abuse or forced marriage with certain family members, you do not go and contact those family members and have those conversations with them. You don't do that. It's absolutely something that would increase the risk. And again, you don't try to mediate between families and community members either. Again, significantly increases the risk. When you think about a child protection matter, you shouldn't consider that a child is safe by removing the alleged perpetrator from the household. Again, like I've talked about, it can increase the risk. We do really need to think about as well, if we're removing, if we're thinking about a child being at risk, in normal circumstances when a child is at risk of significant harm and we need to remove a child from their family unit, we often want to put them with friends or family that are safe. Now, within the context of honour-based abuse and forced marriage, family members or other people within that community may also pose a significant risk of harm to that child that you don't really know about. So just placing that child with another family within that community could absolutely be the same level of risk. You have to be really careful about confidentiality data and information around honour-based abuse, because what we do know from previous cases is that if a victim leaves that family home and they decide to leave and be independent, that the family will make really, really concerted efforts to try and find them. And I've had a case where the family purported to be a safe family member and pretended to be somebody else and contacted me trying to get information from me. We had a family member using the victim's email address to contact the school to try and get information from the school. We had family members phoning up the police switchboard to try and get information by bypassing me. They went to all sorts of lengths to find information and did things such as reporting another family, a safe family member, for firearms offences, so that this person's arrested, to try and take the sort of police attention away from them and to try and force the victim into coming back by putting pressure on her through other family members. So you have to be really careful about information, confidentiality, and sometimes what we will do in really significant cases is lock the information down. And just don't think it's any less serious if there hasn't been any physical violence. We know that there can be threats, and those threats can go straight to murder. There might not be anything in between. So please don't think that it's less serious in those cases. We can go on to the next slide. So we talk about multi-agency safeguarding, and this is really important because we absolutely have to work together in cases of honour-based abuse and forced marriage for safeguarding purposes. This is not something that it's the police's job to fix, or social care's job to fix, or health or education, but we have to work in partnership in cases such as these. There are obviously statutory safeguarding responsibilities for us, for children and adults, which we should absolutely follow the procedures that we will also follow. But what you might think of in addition to that is some of the things that I've just spoken about: moving a victim to a safe location, thinking your legal options such as a forced marriage prevention order, and then thinking about who's going to be the best agency to apply for that. if there's a risk of travelling abroad, thinking about the things I've talked about fingerprints, DNA, photographs, and markers that the police can do. Sorry, the chat pops up. When people put chat in, it pops up in front of the screen and I can't see what's next. And then, yes, we've got lots of things that we could do around working with the Forced Marriage Unit and the Foreign Commonwealth Office to repatriate British citizens as well. If the person isn't a British citizen and they don't have a British passport, then we're not able to do that. So that's really important. There might be people within the family on spousal visas or other visas that don't give us those same options, which can be really frustrating actually, because it doesn't mean to say that they're not a victim, it just limits what we can do. And if we go to the next slide. So these are some local and national links for you towards the end of this presentation. So starting off with some of the local links for you there, so contact details for Sabina at the Sky Project, for myself, and I work really closely with Panita Bassi, who's my thematic support. So you're always able to contact us if you need advice. Next link are the partners that we work with in terms of domestic abuse, but they do have forced marriage and honour-based abuse specialists. We work really closely with the Refugee Women of Bristol, who are just absolutely awesome and can give brilliant support to the women who find themselves in difficult situations in the Bristol area. And then on the next slide, I think there are more national support services. The Forced Marriage Unit do have an out of hours number, which is the second number that you see, and they are really very good at giving advice. And they can give advice for FGM, forced marriage, and honour-based abuse. So don't think it has to be just a case of forced marriage to pick up the phone to them. Carmen and Ivana are very good, and I think perhaps probably a special mention to ICRO as well, which are a really, really good support service. And what's really important is that they have people that will be able to speak to women in their own language and have those conversations, which I just think is really important. And Sabina, I don't know whether you want to say anything about the advice that you can give or any of the other support services that we're referencing here.
I think you've covered it all. From our perspective, it's mainly training needs that we can deliver, because we're not a 24-hour service. That's what we do. But I chair the Forced Marriage Working Group as well. So if there are organisations that do want to tap into that, just pop me an email. But the importance is that we work together, because we're all going to have different strengths and how to help each other. And certainly we've had emails from concerns about victims of forced marriage. And what I have done is, because I know contacting the police, or now Larissa, I can then tap into her details and say, look, we've got somebody, and we can work together to try and keep that person safe, because that's the main thing. That's what we want to do. So yeah, multi-agency working key.
Yeah. So that's the end of our presentation. So Natalie, I don't know if we want to stop recording and then open to any questions that anybody might have.